Does anyone have a mock orange bush or tree around them? I haven't. Who said yes?
I said yes from Centerville.
Oh, great. Oh, they're in Centerville. That's lovely. I haven't seen one since I was in West Virginia.
Well, where I grew up, over on Conquest Beach and over at Conquest Farm, there were a number of mock orange trees, and I know there are some here on the outside of Centerville. It's a southern plant. It was everywhere at college when I was at Hollins, and there were mock oranges everywhere, and we'd have battles with them.
It's fascinating. So basically it's a tree that smells kind of orangey, but also, I mean, deceptively so from what I remember of it, but also there's just this, I don't know, after smell of it that's not orangey. Maybe Cecily
bitter.
Can give a bitter. Yeah, that's a really.
Yes, bitter. Yeah.
Yeah. So it has this sweetness and this bitterness.
The fruit, well, the flower has sweetness, but the fruit is completely bitter and disagreeable.
Like inedible, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I think that plays into the poem really, really nicely too. So here's mock orange. It is not the moon, I tell you. It is these flowers lighting the yard. I hate them. I hate them as I hate sex. The man's mouth sealing my mouth. The man's paralyzing body. And the cry that always escapes. The low, humiliating premise of union. In my mind tonight, I hear the question and pursuing answer fused in one sound that mounts and mounts and then is split into the old selves, the tired antagonisms. Do you see? We were made fools of. And the scent of mock orange drifts through the window. How can I rest? How can I be content when there is still that odor in the world? So I guess maybe what we can try to pick out from this is, I mean, we see the accessible language. You don't have to look up a single word in the poem, right? Maybe mock orange if you're not accustomed to what that is, but even in the title, right? Even in the name, you can get that it's not really orange, that it is, I don't know, a disguised interloper, right? That it proceeds as if it is orange, but it's not really. It's a fake or a deceptor, a betrayer, right? And then maybe we can just talk a little bit about the use of metaphor in the poem. Like, what do you see as, especially like when she says, I hate them as I hate sex, right? Why does the speaker hate the poem, the mock orange, and why does she hate sex? Like, sex is a hard thing to hate, I think, right?
Not necessarily.
Well, right, and so the speaker says that sex is kind of like mock orange, right? So why is this sex not so good?
Well, in her particular case.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead. She's given you a number of examples of things she does not care for, things that she dislikes.
Like what?
The man's mouth, the paralyzing body, but in particular, she dislikes the loss of control and the fact that she is placed in a position of doing something that is beyond her, and then having to come back to the world and having it be not improved by this activity.
Not improved is I think that's a lovely choice of words. Yeah. What about others? What do other people think?
Well, I think there's a connection between the premise of union, which sounds like it is maybe a mock union, and the scent of mock orange. I mean, she feels like a fool in
We were
both
made
cases.
fools of. We were told that we would be united as one body in this act, right? But really, what she feels is paralyzed, right? It's a premise of union, not a real union. It's not authentic, right? For her, at least, right? It feels humiliating, right? And that's the part where, I mean, it gets really deep and kind of dark there, right? That it's these flowers, it's like we think of sex, especially like sort of marital sex, as, you know, something that erases boundaries between two people, brings them into one body, right? But this is not that, right? Just like the mock orange blossoms are not the moon, right? And they're not actually real orange trees, right? And so the metaphor of this blossom, right? This kind of fertilizing tree thing, right? Allows her to think about sexuality, marriage, maybe even, right? If you read the whole book, there's more about marriage. And the metaphor just allows us to unfold everything, right? So it's I guess what I love about this poem and use of metaphor is that it allows us to think more deeply than just see something, right? The metaphor isn't decorous. It's not just, you know, pretty. It's not just lighting the yard, right? It's helping us think more deeply about the matter at hand, which is like, how do we give up or transcend ourselves, right? Is transcending ourselves something good? Or do we just trot out that notion for people who we want to give up their identities, their bodies, their things, right? And not for other people, you know? I mean, I don't think the man experiences that act the same way in the poem, right? I bet it would be news to him, right? So that's what I sort of love here. I also love, after a line like in the third stanza, the cry that always escapes, the low, humiliating. I love the really sharp and surprising diction and feeling are there. And then Louise Glück, whenever she makes a really emotional sort of statement like that, she's going to take a step back from it. Like premise of union. The diction is, I don't know. Like I think premise of union might be on a bank statement. You know what I mean? The language is less emotional, right? And I think she's really good at this in her writing as a general rule. Whenever you get really emotional, take a step back in your diction and you allow more room for that emotion to sort of fill up, right? It feels weird to say, maybe it's anti-intuitive, but if you fill up emotion in every space of the poem, the reader doesn't have any room to feel the emotion, right? Sort of like we have to back away a little bit and let the emotion balloon into that space, right? I don't want to, I could read Mock Orange every day for the rest of my life and see new things in it, but let's move on to a different poem too. This is Widows. Would anyone like to read this poem for us? I don't have to read.
Could I just ask a question?
Oh, sure.
Sorry, time out. For whatever reason, I'm not able to open up the poem packet.
Oh,
I was actually going to jump in and say, I wasn't able to either. And I wondered maybe, James, if we just send it to everybody afterwards, because even if I could open it right now, I feel like I'd spend more time trying to read it on print, and I'd rather just listen. Is it effective, to just listen and we can share later?
we can totally do that. Or I could try to find it as a Word document on my computer somewhere.
I'd be happy to just share my screen because I was able to open it for.
Oh, great. Let's
That'd
do
be
that.
great. Thank you.
Let's do
Thank
that.
you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Of course.
All right. So
And we'll send afterwards also.
Thank you.
cool.
And
Okay.
I'm reading it out of the book, so,
Okay.
Good for you.
oh,
That's
there
great.
you go.
So you
Thank
can you all
very
see that now?
Yep, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, especially since
Yeah.
this one's longer, that does really help.
Yeah, that's right.
much. You.
So this is Widows. Does anyone want to read the poem?
I'd be glad to.
Oh, great. Please.
Really? Okay. Widows. My mother's playing cards with my aunt, spite and malice, the family pastime, the game my grandmother taught all her daughters. Midsummer, too hot to go out. Today, my aunt's ahead. She's getting the good cards. My mother's dragging, having trouble with her concentration. She can't get used to her own bed this summer. She had no trouble last summer getting used to the floor. She learned to sleep there to be near my father. He was dying. He got a special bed. My aunt doesn't give an inch, doesn't make allowance for my mother's weariness. It's how they were raised. You show respect by fighting, to let up insults the opponent. Each player has one pile to the left, 5 cards in the hand. It's good to stay inside on days like this, to stay where it's cool. And this is better than other games, better than solitaire. My grandmother thought ahead. She prepared her daughters. They have cards, they have each other. They don't need any more companionship. All afternoon, the game goes on, but the sun doesn't move. It just keeps beating down, turning the grass yellow. That's how it must seem to my mother. And then suddenly, something's over. My aunt's been at it longer. Maybe that's why she's been playing better. Her cards evaporate. That's what you want. That's the object in the end. The one who has nothing wins.
Such a heartbreaking poem,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, and how does she get our hearts to break? Like, what is it about the poem that feels so emotional? The ending. Yeah, and why? Why is it the ending? What is it about the ending that feels that gets into us?
The ending actually is not the part that breaks my heart.
I think there are a few places. Yeah, tell me another one, Maria.
Well, I mean, sleeping on the floor, of course. And as it becomes clear that, I mean, we know from the title, but as we begin to sort of understand the story of the dying father.
Yeah.
And
so
the to me, I think it's the change from last year to this year in her mom.
and as that change becomes clearer, as we focus in on what has happened and how these folks are, like what this game is, it's just 2 women playing a game, right? 2 sisters playing a game.
But what are
That's
they
not
playing? They're playing spite and malice. And the aunt is not giving anything, which can be spiteful.
And malicious.
And malicious.
Mhm.
They have each other. They don't need any companionship. It's about spite and malice taking over and leaving you with nothing.
Right, yeah, so I think actually it's more about they're playing this game, right? Which is, a vicious card game, right? And they're playing it like the aunt's not letting up at all, right? She's playing to win, and which feels maybe cold for this person who's just lost her husband, right? And can't get used to her bed, so she can't sleep. But really, it's an act of compassion and love, right? Because she's not, right? She's not making her feel pitied, right? Yeah, and we get that only through.
It's how they were raised.
It's what? I'm sorry.
I said it's how they were raised. You show respect by fighting.
Yep. And we get this deep emotion. We get what's really happening through the card game and through her using the card game, right? Naming it Spite and Malice. I've never heard of this game, and I'm sure it is called Spite and Malice.
It is a game. It's called Spite and Malice. My mother could have been this. I mean, my grandmother taught it to her. My mother taught it to me. I think I probably taught it to my daughter. So I'm like, how did she know my life?
Exactly.
I actually had no idea that it was really a card game. I thought that that was part of the poem, that the game they were playing was Spite and Malice, but that they were really playing something else, hearts or spades or, you know, rummy or something. I didn't realize that. I thought that was kind of part of it.
Yeah, I've never played the game. I've never looked it up, but I assumed that it was a real game, right? And that was part of it. What looks like this coldness, right, is really respect and for what they've both been through, right? And we get it by, right, that this is sort of the family pastime, right? There's all these ways that the metaphor allows Glick to speak out of, or speak with two mouths, one that's literal and one that's deeply metaphoric or gestures to emotion that sort of like an iceberg, right? You see the tip, but there's much, much more below the surface, right?
I was really impressed with the lines. My grandmother thought ahead and she prepared her daughters. The card game is, of course, you know, a metaphor for loss in life. And I wonder if the grandmother lost her husband also, and perhaps she was not prepared, but in her own way, through the card games and the daughters, the sisters having one another, they don't need anything besides that. And that's how they're dealing, and she's preparing them to deal with loss. And the other lines that I'm not familiar with this poem, guys, but you know, who wants to sleep on a floor? Who does not want to be in their own bed? But by sleeping on the floor, her husband was still alive. And so there she was able to lie on that hard floor by him while he was in his literally sick bed. And so there's just so much emotion in this. You could just cry. I mean, it's a beautiful poem that I have never heard before, but there's a lot of loss, but a lot of stiff upper lip, and you must go on in it also.
And it's that restraint, right? That, I mean, Marianne Moore says, right, that we feel the greatest emotion not in silence, but in restraint, right? Mm-hmm. And you can feel that in Glick's words, right? The slow unspooling of very emotional information, right? He was dying, he got a special bed, right? That's a huge statement to say. It comes, you know, 2 stanzas in, and then my aunt doesn't give an inch, right? As soon as she says something really emotional, step back, right? Mm-hmm. Even we have the stanza break, so it's maybe 2 steps back, right? I think it's a really instructive thing for us all to take, right? Like when we write about deeply sentimental topics, right? Like loss and death, right? Things that we already know are packed with emotion. We have to write about them from remove. And that's what metaphor allows us to do, right? We're not talking about cards here. We're talking about 2 women, 2 sisters in their relationships, and surviving loss. Right?
I think that the stanza that of all afternoon, the game goes on, but the sun doesn't move is a really, it almost seems like a transitional stanza, and yet there's so much in that of time and the perception of time and how we value what is happening around us or don't notice it until it's over. And I think it's really beautiful.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that stanza, that detail, the image of the grass turning yellow, of dying, right? And that's how it must seem to my mother. The whole
Yeah.
world just must seem on its way out, right? Because that's what she's just survived.
Yeah. Mhm.
And that it feels how it feels when someone is dying too, right? It feels as though that period, and when someone is being born too, it feels like that process is going to go on forever as kind of a static state, and then suddenly it's over and the world is different. One of the things that I know from playing Spite and Malice is that it's a very, at least in my family, very intense, fast, like kind of rambunctious game. And the idea you're supposed to be faster than your opponent. And so I'm really aware of the contrast between that intensity and the sort of abandon that I remember feeling playing that game, and all the restraint of the language and the sort of oppressive feeling of the heat of the day and that kind of more deliberate pace of the poem.
Yeah, and allowing, like, it's hard to get a metaphor just right so that you are talking about two different, really unrelated things, right? Card game, the loss of a husband. I mean, that's the distance between those things is huge, right? That's what a metaphor does, right? It joins these two things that are really far apart, and that's the pleasure of a metaphor too, right? A metaphor that's where the two things are so close, like it doesn't feel pleasurable to bridge that distance, right? But yeah, to have this card game and the loss of the father, to be able to talk about the loss in terms of the card game, right, allows us to talk about something really heavy in terms of something that's not at all, right? Like we all hate losing a card game, but the next day you forget about it, right? The next day you're not going to forget about the husband you lost, right? She can't even sleep in her own bed without him now, right?
And there's a sense of tension in those two types of losses as well, right? In Spite and Malice, at least the way my family plays it, you want to lose, right? You want to lose cards. You want loss to happen in your deck, and that's the way you win. So you want to lose the things around you in order to win. That's the desire. Whereas the loss of a husband is just kind of the exact opposite of it. It's not something that you can recover from. So to bridge that tension in this kind of really beautiful way by having the aunt say, well, I'm not going to let you lose what cards you have left in your hand. Like that I think is an interesting perspective to think about in terms of what you were saying earlier about it being an act of compassion, is not allowing your sister more loss, even if that means that you win the game.
Yeah.
I just looked up at Google the definition of the spite and malice, and here's what it says. Spite and malice, also known as cat and mouse or screw your neighbor, is a traditional card game for two or more players. It is the reworking of the late 19th century continental game crapette.
All of these names, right? I mean, in some way, the poet in all of us will look at a card game like Spite and Malice and be like, yeah, that's a poem, right? We're gonna play Spite and Malice. Yeah, that's a dramatic situation, right? Yeah. And I think what's good about Glick is she contextualizes it with the grandmother. This is passed down, right? This is old wisdom, right? And then also just that sort of tossed off general address you, that's what you want in the end, right? That's the object in the end. Yeah, and it's better than playing solitaire too, right? So there's this way in which, right, Glick develops sort of the language of the poem to like talk about other things, right? Like, who wants to play solitaire when you can, I don't know, go hunt mock orange, so to speak. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, I mean, I really, it's interesting. I think really see it as a grief process that she's, you know, she's not sleeping in her bed, I guess, but she comes out of it. She's got her sister, she's got her daughter who's writing about her, presumably there with her, and she's got this generational connection from her mother. And, you know, it feels at the end like, you know, kind of life goes on. The one who has nothing at the end wins. And she's sort of proceeding, you know, her life is proceeding, her relationships, her connections. And to me, it feels there's heartbreak, but there's also a peace about it.
Well, I forgot what the title of the poem was until we started talking, and then I saw the line about, you know, my aunt's been at it longer, maybe why she's playing better. And I went, oh, right, it's called Widows. So, you know, she has been at dealing with this grief for longer than her sister has.
Yeah, that title is really important, isn't it? Right? Like, we know the father's been lost because of the widows, right? Or that the husband has been lost, rather. The speaker's father.
What is the title? What is the title? I can't remember.
Sorry.
Oh, it's called Widows.
Widows. Okay. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, this and this is from Descending Figure, or is this from the Triumph of Achilles? Oh no, Mock Orange was Triumph of Achilles. Can you go all the way back up, or I can actually just look. I just wanted to.
There you go.
Oh, it's from RiverArts. Okay, yeah. And I think the last poem in RiverArts is about her father, and it's this tiny, maybe 6-line poem that's just like gutting. That book is one of my favorites. I mean, it's hard to pick a favorite Louise Glück book, to be honest with you. They're all pretty terrific. She likes to experiment with different with sort of formal aspects. Like mostly her lines are really small, but in RiverArts the lines are a little bit larger. She has a book called Faithful and Virtuous Night, where the speaker is a boy, and the lines are really long. Anyway, that's a really recent book too. So there are all these little projects in her books that I think are really interesting too for a reader. Let's look at the last poem, Parable of the Dove. I'm really fascinated about perspective in this poem. Let's see. Okay. Would someone like to read this one for us?
I'll read it.
Great, thank you.
Parable of the Dove. A dove lived in a village. When it opened its mouth, sweetness came out. Sound like a silver light around the cherry bough. But the dove wasn't satisfied. It saw the villagers gathered to listen under the blossoming tree. It didn't think, I am higher than they are. It wanted to walk among them, to experience the violence of human feeling, in part for its song's sake. So it became human. It found passion. It found violence, first conflated, then as separate emotions. And these were not contained by music. Thus, its song changed. The sweet notes of its longing to become human soured and flattened. Then the world drew back. The mutant fell from love as from the cherry branch. It fell stained with the bloody fruit of the tree. So it is true after all, not merely a rule of art. Change your form and you change your nature. And time does this to us.
Thank you very much for that good reading. Yeah, so for this poem, we see characteristic Louise Glück statements, right? it wanted to walk among them, to experience the violence of human feeling, right? Sort of flat, neutral statements, interpretive, right? That help us understand what the dove wanted, right? In looking down at humans from that tree. It had accessible language. Also sort of like a very specific story with characters that gesture towards more archetypal characters, right? A dove lived in a village. There are villagers. There's a tree, right? But we don't have like really specific villagers, right? If we did, they would still be kind of like maybe the milkmaid or the banker or whatever, right? They wouldn't be these very sharply drawn, because that would take interest and our sort of our caring away from the main character, the dove. This is sort of like a, I don't know, it's a parable. So it's participating in that tradition of archetypal, right? And maybe another way to think of this as is like a fairy tale too, right? And fairy tales never have very, very specific, they'll have types, right? So she's working with types here. That's really hard to do because we think of that as sort of general and not specific. And always when we're writing, we want to be specific, right? We want to show, don't tell, that kind of advice. And with Glick, there's a really thin line between really like vague statements like the violence of human feeling that actually do produce some tension, right? Human feeling is really big, but the violence of human feeling, right, is where it starts getting tense, right? Like, do we think of human feeling as violent? That's where it gets interesting, right? So, so the dove wants to experience this sort of violent feeling, the being stained and vulnerable, feeling violence, right? And it changes the dove's song, right? Experiences this violent feeling, the violence of human feeling, changes its song, right? So it's not so sweet anymore. It sours and flattens, which then gives it a different range, right? It just doesn't sing this one sweet song. It also has sour and flatness to its voice, right? To its repertoire, maybe, right? And I think like if the poem ended with "it fell stained with the bloody fruit of the tree," that would have been a fine ending. Another fine ending would have been, "So it is true after all, not merely a rule of art. Change your form and you change your nature." That would have been a fine ending too, beautiful. But the ending she pushes to, time does this to us. You don't have a choice, right? You're going to sour and you're going to flatten, right? The use of perspective there is just really, it just feels revolutionary in the poem. It feels really emotional, right? And there's been an I in the poem before, right? In the second stanza. I mean, it's the dove thinking, I'm not higher than they are, but that I is still there. And she includes herself at the end, right? If it was time does this to you, it would feel different than time does this to us, right? Yeah. I think like that's another of Louise Glück's genius, is that she's not, she's always pushing to interpret beyond the sort of individual and towards a more communal, or I don't like saying universal because I don't know if I really believe in universal, but something that's larger than the individual, the communal, right?
This poem reminds me of a Rumi poem. I don't know how many people are familiar or read Rumi, but it kind of reminds me of like a little nugget, a story with some nuggets of wisdom hidden within what's almost like a fairy tale type story.
Right, a parable's got to have a lesson at the end, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Rumi's so great for
Yeah.
that too. Yeah.
Well, if Mary Oliver kept his book on her bedside stand, then he's got to be good.
Got to be all right. Yeah. Mary Oliver's another really good one at taking, right, like really fine detail and unpacking it, interpreting it in a really surprising way, right? Like who knew we would be talking about time, right? And the violence of time at the beginning of a poem that starts as blandly as a dove lived in a village. I'm not that interested in a dove lived in a village, you know? It's amazing the journey that she takes us on, you know?
Yeah, not just time. Who thought we'd be talking about us? Who would
That's
thought
right.
that it would be so personal?
Yeah, and it's interesting. This book is this is Meadowlands, the book she wrote after winning the Pulitzer Prize. So that's always hard, right? What are you going to do now? And she writes about the dissolution of her marriage, mostly through poems about Penelope and his name went out of my mind, Odysseus, and their son Telemachus. I don't know where the accent falls there. And then she has these Telemachus. So and then she has these other poems, these parable poems in that book. And I in some ways it's my favorite Louise Glück book. It's very narrative. So if you're someone who likes to read novels, this book reads sort of like a novel because it is a marriage that goes away in the end.
Which book did you say, James?
This is fun. It's called Meadowlands.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I think it's an extraordinary book that you actually could kind of read it in an afternoon. It's just that quick, you know.
James,
There's some poets. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, it's okay. I was just say I like how you talked about that. There are a couple of other places that it would have felt natural for the poem to conclude at that point. And you pointed out those couple, and I was sort of thinking the same thing. And it really was that last line that was the kicker to me, because you kind of read that change your form and you change your nature. And there may be a part of people that thinks, well, maybe I can change my form or evolve, but I'm not going to truly change my nature. Like I was kind of, as you finished reading, kind of arguing like, oh, yeah, that can't happen. We should be careful to not let that happen sometimes. And then the last line just totally did me in, because I was like, oh, right. Yeah, sometimes it's just time and you have no control over that.
I mean, it's just like, I don't know if you've read like a book and you hated it or you didn't get it, or an author, and then like 20 years later, you're like, oh yeah, right? Like you've been able to absorb something that you just couldn't connect to before that, right? Yeah, I feel that way about Wallace Stevens, who I was forced to read like 3 different times in my education, and I really hated him until the last time when I begrudgingly liked him.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you'll notice I am not talking about Wallace Stevens in this salon, right? I mean, Wallace Stevens is a kind of poet who Glick really likes, actually. I think she's really, really fond of T.S. Eliot. And she said before that she likes a poem that calls to you, that like is in conversation, right? That says, I'm a voice, listen to me, right? It's not the moon, I tell you, right? Another poet would have said, it's not the moon, and not included you, right? But she wants to speak intimately, closely to you, without drawing too much purchase on your emotional involvement, right? She has funnier poems, I will say. I do think she's a funny poet at times. There's a poem that says something like, something about like, this situation is not without candor, and here I may be of some use. And I find like little statements like that, they're arch, biting, witty. That's where her humor is mostly, right? There are reviewers like William Logan who calls her like our saddest poet. But I find that that is, well, besides being a gendered response to Glick's work, I think that that's, it misses the mark. I think she can be very, very funny in a very arch kind of way, right? She definitely writes about heavy subjects, and there's a spareness to some of her lines and some of her poems that often can read as austere. But yeah, I think she has lots of tonal, she has a big tonal palette, I guess I would say.
Well, and there's so many layers. It's not, I think none of these poems are all one thing. So they're not all sad or all bitter or all even yearning.
Yeah, even at Spite and Malice, right? Like, it looks like it's meanness, but it's really love, right? This dove, like, is so fascinated with us, it wants to become human, right? Which is maybe the opposite of, like, there are so many birds in poems, maybe because we're always like, so fascinated by those things that can lift off and maintain flight, that are not so earthbound and imminent. Yeah, so I think the reversing is really interesting, right? That there's something laudatory about being human, even though, gosh, we're so confused, which is what the violence of human feeling can be. We're intense, right?
Well, it's a lot like, well, there are a million stories. I mean, the first thing that came to my mind was Star Trek and Data, or Spock.
Yes.
Both of whom, you're supposed to want them to be able to be human. But even things like The Little Mermaid, giving up her mermaid life to be human.
Well, she gives up her voice, doesn't she?
I guess she does.
She does. So
Yeah.
she can be human, but she can never speak.
I don't even know if I'm not really that familiar with that story, but I knew that she came out of the ocean.
Yeah.
Yeah, she gives up that life and that community so that she can be in love and join this human, right, community. And the price is her voice, right?
Right.
Yeah, which she
in many
recovers
ways,
at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is many ways what the dove has done is has given up the sweet voice to become something that it should not be.
Right. Because it wanted to experience what it was like to have a different kind of voice, right? Yeah. And time does this to us.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it wanted to be more complex, and humans are complex, and emotions are complex, more than the sweet sound of the silver around the cherry bough or whatever it is. So
I also love that when we encounter something that is outside of what we've encountered, right? When it found passion, it found violence as separate emotions, right? First conflated, then separate emotions. Its music had to change, right? And so it developed this other sort of way to express those emotions, right? I love that. I love that we adapt.
James, this has been wonderful. It's very rare that Mariah and I both lose track of time because we always, try to keep, to a certain amount, and I want leave people wanting more. And I sense that we're all going to leave wanting more today because there is really just so much to delve into. It's really interesting too. Hopefully you've been reading the chat, everybody. I haven't really jumped in with comments, but people have made some wonderful and interesting comments, and I feel like everybody has really had, something to contribute. So that's we are speaker and not as many talkers, and this was really cool today. Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Oh,
Thank
my
Thank you
pleasure.
very,
Thank you all
very
for
much. It was
coming. And-
wonderful.
Yeah, I wasn't following the chat at all, but I'm sorry that I didn't. These are really smart comments, and
I know,
great to see
I wasn't
everybody.
looking at it either.
Yeah.
Well, thank you,
Well,
Jen. for coming in.
More.
Sure. I hope that you will all go and read more Louise Glück in your life.
Yes, yes.
I think we
James,
absolutely should.
Oh, yes.
What about her essays, James? Real quickly, I've not read any of her essays, but what do you think of them?
I think Proofs and Theories is, for me, I'll put it in the chat, is one of
Okay.
like the best craft books. I think
Okay.
it's so terrific. I haven't read, there's a recent book of essays and I haven't read those yet. I've heard good things, but
Okay.
I will also say that she has her Nobel speech was a little racially ignorant. Is the kindest way I could put it. Like there's definitely some spots that Louise Glück could use a little bit more education on.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, James, we often leave with a quick toast so everybody can go out. And I wrote down something earlier while you were talking about when you're writing, stepping back to make room for emotion. And I just, given everything going on in the world today, and some of the comments people were making about, things happening in just the news in the world and everything we've all experienced in the past year, I just kind of wanted to toast for all of us finding time to step back and make time for emotion and to really experiencing those emotions. And thank you for the wonderful conversation. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
for
you
having
all.
me
This
back.
was
Cheers,
perfect.
everybody.
James, I hope you'll be willing to come back again. We'll have you as many times as you
Real
want.
soon.
My pleasure. My pleasure. All right, everyone, take
You
good
all.
care.
Bye.
Thank you
Love
so
ya.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.